Discover Zen secrets to save your time. The illusion of time. Time is the one resource that, once spent, can never be regained. Yet, most of us live as if we have an endless supply. We postpone our dreams, delay our happiness, and tell ourselves that someday we will start living. But what if that someday never comes? Buddha once said, "The trouble is, you think you have time." This simple yet profound truth reveals one of humanity's greatest illusions, the belief in endless tomorrows. Today, we explore why time is the most valuable currency and how to stop wasting it before it's too late. Chapter 1. The Man Who Believed in Tomorrow. There was once a man named Daniel, who was ambitious but hesitant. He had big dreams, traveling the world, learning philosophy, writing a book, but he never acted on them. "I'll start next year," he often said. Years passed, the seasons changed, and the world around him kept moving. Friends he once knew had ventured out, chased their dreams, and returned with stories of triumph and failure. Yet, Daniel remained in the same place, bound by the illusion of time. He convinced himself that the future held the key, that when circumstances aligned perfectly, he would finally take action. But time, like a river, never pauses for anyone. His hair turned gray, his body weakened, yet he still whispered the same excuse. "Tomorrow, I will begin," but tomorrow never came. One autumn afternoon, while sitting alone in his garden, lost in thought about all he had not done, an old sage approached him. The sage was a man of serene presence, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of 1,000 lifetimes. "Tell me," the sage asked, his voice calm but penetrating, "what have you done with your time?" Daniel hesitated. He opened his mouth but found himself struggling for an answer. "I have been preparing, thinking, planning, waiting for the right moment." The sage chuckled, shaking his head gently. "And when is the right moment?" Daniel looked away, his chest tightening with a sudden realization. He had no answer because the truth was too painful to admit. He had spent his entire life waiting. The sage sat beside him and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Do you know what the greatest deception of the mind is?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. "The illusion of time," the sage continued. "We always believe we have more of it. We say, 'tomorrow,' as if it is promised. But tomorrow is nothing more than a whisper carried away by the wind. The past is a memory. The future is a dream. And the only thing you truly possess is this moment, now." Daniel felt a deep pang in his heart. He had read about such teachings before, but never had the truth hit him so hard. The sage then picked up a single dry leaf from the ground. "Do you see this leaf?" Daniel nodded. It once clung to the branch, full of life, believing it had all the time in the world. But seasons change, and now it lies here, brittle and forgotten. Had it known how brief its time was, would it have danced more in the wind? Would it have basked longer in the sunlight? Daniel lowered his gaze, realizing that he, too, had spent his life waiting for a perfect season, one that never came. "You have spent years dreaming, Daniel, but tell me, have you ever lived?" Daniel swallowed hard, unable to respond. The sage smiled gently, sensing the turmoil within him. "It is not too late," he said softly. "The best time to act was yesterday. The second best time is now. Do not let another moment slip away." A gust of wind rustled through the garden, carrying the dry leaf away. Daniel watched it dance in the air before disappearing from sight. For the first time in years, something within him shifted, the weight of his regrets, the burden of waiting. It all seemed meaningless now. He stood up, inhaling deeply, feeling the crisp autumn air fill his lungs. He would no longer wait. He would begin. With a newfound sense of urgency, Daniel walked into his house. He pulled out a suitcase, dusted off his old journals, and picked up a pen. The world awaited, and he would no longer let time steal his dreams. Tomorrow would never come, but today was here. Chapter 2. The Illusions That Steal Your Time. The sage led Daniel into a vast desert, where mirages shimmered in the distance, promising water, shade, and paradise. The heat was merciless, and Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow. "Do you see those illusions?" the sage asked, his voice calm as the shifting sand beneath their feet. Daniel nodded. In the distance, he saw travelers running desperately toward the mirages, convinced that they had found salvation. Yet, when they reached the shimmering pools, they fell to their knees in despair. Only dry sand met their touch. Many people chase illusions, believing they will find fulfillment. The sage continued, but when they finally reach what they sought, they find nothing but emptiness. Daniel watched in silence. The desperation of the travelers reflected something within him. How often had he chased after things he thought would bring him happiness, only to feel unsatisfied? The sage walked forward, gesturing toward different scenes appearing in the desert air, each more vivid than the last. 1. The illusion of wealth. Before them, a man sat atop a mountain of gold. His robes were of the finest silk, and countless chests of treasure surrounded him. Yet his face was filled with anxiety, his hands clenching his coins as if afraid they might vanish. Every few moments, he looked over his shoulder, as if expecting thieves. His eyes darted about, restless and afraid. He thought wealth would bring him peace, the sage said, but now he only knows fear. Daniel saw other figures in the distance, people striving relentlessly to climb their own mountains of gold. Yet none of them ever stopped to rest. It was as if they had forgotten why they started the climb in the first place. He is a prisoner of his own desires. The sage continued, the more he owns, the more he fears losing it. But tell me, can a man drink gold when he is thirsty? Can it shield him from death? Daniel shook his head, understanding the weight of the lesson. 2. The illusion of approval. Next, they saw a man constantly changing his face like masks in a theater performance. He shifted expressions rapidly. One moment he was smiling, the next he looked serious, then apologetic. He turned in every direction, desperately seeking the approval of those around him. His body was weary, his soul fragmented. Many waste time seeking validation from others, forgetting that true peace comes from within, the sage explained. Daniel watched the man for a long time. No matter how many times he changed his face, there was always someone he could not please. The man grew exhausted, yet he never stopped. It is like chasing the wind, the sage said. You run and run, but you will never catch it. Daniel felt a sting in his heart. Had he, too, lived for the opinions of others instead of his own truth? 3. The illusion of anger and resentment. A woman appeared before them, clutching a burning coal in her hands. Her fingers trembled, her face twisted in pain, but she refused to let go. The fire scorched her flesh, yet she held on, her eyes filled with rage. Holding on to anger burns only yourself, the sage whispered. Daniel swallowed hard. He had seen this before, not just in others, but in himself. How many times had he held on to grudges, convinced that they gave him strength, only to feel their poison seep into his soul? It is a fire that consumes the heart. The sage continued, we think our anger punishes others, but in truth, it only destroys us. The woman finally collapsed, her hands charred and broken, but even then, she refused to let go. Daniel felt a deep sorrow. How many people carried their pain like this, refusing to release it, even when it destroyed them? 4. The illusion of regret. A few steps away, an old man sat by a pool of water, staring at his own reflection. His lips trembled as he whispered the same words over and over. If only, if only. But the water never answered him. Some waste time living in the past, the sage said, trapped in what could have been, instead of embracing what is. The old man continued his lament, his voice barely above a whisper. His body was frail, yet his heart carried the unbearable weight of years lost to regret. The past is a shadow, the sage continued. No matter how much we reach for it, we cannot hold it, but if we keep looking back, we will never see the road ahead. Daniel felt his own regrets rise within him, memories of opportunities missed, Words unsaid, roads never taken, but for the first time, he saw regret for what it truly was. A chain that bound him to a place he could never return to. The moment of realization. The sage turned to Daniel and asked, "Which one are you?" Daniel fell silent, his mind replaying his life. He had been all of them. The man who chased wealth. The man who sought approval. The one who clung to anger. And the one who drowned in regret. Tears welled in his eyes as he looked at the sage. I have lived in illusion." The sage nodded, his expression kind. "Then it is time to awaken." A sudden gust of wind swept through the desert, and the illusions shattered like glass. The man on the mountain of gold, the mask wearer, the woman with burning coal, and the regretful elder, all dissolved into dust, carried away by the wind. Daniel looked around. The desert was now empty, except for him and the sage. And for the first time, he felt truly present. "Awareness is the first step," the sage said gently. "Now, what will you do with the time that remains?" Daniel breathed deeply. No longer would he chase illusions. No longer would he waste his days in fear, in waiting, in anger, or in regret. For the first time in his life, he would live. Chapter 3. The Three Teachings to Never Waste Time Again. The sage then led Daniel to a river where countless people were frantically trying to catch fish. But these fish were only reflections on the water's surface, shimmering, flickering, yet forever out of reach. This is how many people spend their lives, the sage explained, chasing things that cannot be caught, waiting for a future that never comes. Daniel watched as the people grew frustrated, their hands grasping at illusions, their eyes filled with longing. Some shouted in anger, others collapsed in exhaustion, yet, none of them stopped to question why they were chasing something that did not exist. "Then what should I do?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying both curiosity and urgency. The sage placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, his gaze filled with wisdom. "Remember these three teachings," he said, "if you wish to never waste time again. Learn to master them. 1. Live in the present moment. The sage led Daniel further along the river until they reached a serene spot where the water flowed gently. Wildflowers swayed in the breeze, and birds chirped in harmony with the rustling leaves. It was a scene of perfect peace, yet Daniel had never truly seen it before. "You do not own the past," the sage said. "The future is not promised. The only time you have is now. So live fully in this moment, because this moment is your life." Daniel let the words sink in. He thought of all the times he had been present in body but absent in mind, his thoughts always drifting to the someday that never arrived. He had wasted sunrises worrying about tomorrow. He had ignored conversations while planning for one day. He had rushed through meals without ever tasting them. From that day forward, he decided, whenever he ate, he would taste, savoring every flavor as if it were his last meal. Whenever he walked, he would feel the earth beneath his feet, the wind against his skin. Whenever he spoke, he would be fully present, listening, not just hearing, understanding, not just replying. The river continued to flow, untouched by time, and Daniel realized life was happening right now. He had simply been too distracted to notice. 2. Take action, not just plan. The sage pointed toward a man on the riverbank. He sat with a blueprint in his hands, drawing plans for a boat, but never lifting a single piece of wood. "Thinking without action is like a bird with no wings," the sage said. "It will never fly. If you wish to do something, do it now. Waiting is just another form of wasting time." Daniel's heart clenched. He had spent years filling his mind with dreams but had never moved his feet. He had always waited for the perfect time, the perfect conditions, the perfect opportunity. But now he understood, it was action that created perfection, not the other way around. From that moment, he vowed, every dream would be met with action. He would write the first sentence, take the first step, make the first move. Every intention would have a step forward. No more, one day. No more waiting. Daniel rolled up his sleeves. It was time to build the boat, not just design it. 3. Let go of what does not serve you. As they continued walking, they came across a woman struggling to carry an enormous sack of stones on her back. She was hunched over, her face twisted in pain, yet she refused to set the sack down. "What is she doing?" Daniel asked. "She is carrying her past," the sage replied. "Regrets, grudges, fears, all the things that no longer serve her, yet she refuses to let them go." Daniel watched as the woman stumbled, yet she clutched the sack tighter. She believes she cannot be free without her burdens. The sage continued, but in truth, she cannot be free until she releases them. Daniel thought of all the things he had held onto for too long. Regrets over missed opportunities. Anger toward those who had wronged him. Fears that paralyzed him from moving forward. He saw himself in that woman. He had carried his own sack of stones, never realizing that he had the power to let it go at any moment. From that day on, he promised. He would release what did not bring peace. He would not let the past steal his present. The woman in the distance finally loosened her grip. One by one, she let the stones fall, and with every stone that left her hands, she stood taller, walked lighter, breathed deeper. Daniel smiled. He would do the same. The awakening. The river shimmered under the golden light of the setting sun. The sage turned to Daniel, his eyes gentle but firm. "Now you understand," he said. "These are the teachings that will free you from the illusion of wasted time." Daniel looked at the water, no longer seeing the reflections of empty pursuits. Instead, he saw clarity, purpose, and truth. He had spent his life chasing the unreachable, waiting for the unpromised, and carrying the unnecessary. No more. He would live in the present. He would act instead of waiting. He would let go of what weighed him down. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt truly alive. And so, with the teachings of the sage burning in his heart, he stepped forward, not toward an illusion, but toward life itself. Chapter 4. The Awakening, a life no longer wasted. As Daniel absorbed these lessons, the sage disappeared like a wisp of smoke dissolving into the wind. The vast desert that had once seemed endless now felt open, full of possibility rather than emptiness. He was alone again. But this time, everything was different. For years, he had been imprisoned by his own mind, waiting for the perfect moment. Chasing illusions, clinging to regrets. Now, those chains had fallen away, and he saw life as it truly was. He took a deep breath. The air felt fresher. The ground beneath him felt firmer. The sun's warmth on his skin was no longer just heat. It was a reminder that he was alive. Daniel looked at the river before him. Once, he had stood on its banks, watching reflections of false promises ripple across its surface. Now, he saw it clearly, not as a mirage, but as a current constantly moving forward. And so, he made a choice. He no longer waited for a better time to live. He no longer chased what could not be caught. He no longer clung to what was already gone. Instead, he acted. He walked toward the horizon, no longer fearing the unknown. He understood that the future was not a place to reach, but something shaped by each step he took. For the first time, he listened, not just to words, but to silence. For the first time, he saw, not just with his eyes, but with awareness. For the first time, he lived, not in the past, nor in the future, but in the only place that ever truly existed, now. And for the first time, he was free. Conclusion. What are you waiting for? If you have read this far, pause for a moment, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and ask yourself, are you truly living, or just waiting to live? Are you holding on to things that no longer serve you? If you died tomorrow, would you have truly lived today? Look around you. The world moves forward with or without you. The sun rises, the rivers flow, the seasons change. Yet, how often have you hesitated, waiting for a sign, waiting for the right moment, Waiting for something before you allow yourself to truly live? But what if the right moment is now? How much time have you wasted replaying the past, holding on to regrets, nursing old wounds, carrying burdens that serve no purpose? How often have you traded the present moment for an illusion of the future, promising yourself happiness someday, as if life were a rehearsal and not the real thing? The truth is simple. Life is not waiting for you. The regrets will not change. The fears will not disappear on their own. The dreams will not fulfill themselves. But you can choose. Choose to act instead of waiting. Choose to let go instead of holding on. Choose to live fully instead of merely existing. Because if not now, then when? Time is already moving. Start living now.